buenos días para todos.
Everyone. The CIPE, the Chamber of Commerce of Bogota, and the International Cha- uh, Chambers Association would like to welcome you to this event in which we will learn about the results on the poll that we conducted in Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador on their perception on public contracting. At the same time, we will refer to some recommendations that some entrepreneurs and international national experts made on the best way to make the public contracting transparent. We would like to extend a warm welcome to the Chamber of Commerce of Quito and Ipsos, that are entities that help us in a great manner to make this project a successful enterprise. We would also like to inform you that this event is being uh, transmitted live with simultaneous translation. To start, we would like to invite Ana Maria Ferguson, VP of Public-Private Articulation of the Chamber of Commerce of Bogota, the CCB. Good morning, everyone. We'd like to extend a special and a warm greeting on behalf of our president, Nicolas Uribe, who wasn't able to join us here today, but he's really aware and interested in the results of the project. First of all, we would like to extend a warm welcome to Juan Rivadeneira, Executive Director of the Chamber of Commerce of Quito, to Eduardo Herrera, Director of the Anti-Corruption Private Council of Peru, also to John Semko, Regional Director of the CIPE, also to Andrew Wilson, Executive Director of the CIPE, to Felipe Castro, who's representing Ipsos, and Angela Vélez, Director of the CIP office in Colombia. As I was telling you, for the Chamber of Commerce, it's an honor to be here with you today. Within our priorities, we have a line that seeks to promote anti-corruption strategy and transparency in companies. Today, we're going to learn about the results of the anti-corruption perception poll that we conducted with over 2,000 entrepreneurs in Colombia, Peru, and Colombia and Ecuador. This poll is going to give us key elements for all the actions that we've been taking from the different entities, not only the Chamber of Commerce, in order to be able to help companies to reduce anti-corruption and strengthen their anti-corruption strategies in that way, to have more consolidated business and improve their strategy. So we would like to start the agenda, and we will have a panel. We will talk a little bit more in detail on the strategies that we've been developing in the Chamber of Commerce, and it will be a pleasure and an honor to be incorporating the strategy from other actors. So welcome to the event. Thank you very much, Ana Maria, for your kind words. Now I would like to invite John Semko, the Regional Director for the CIPE. John Semko is a dedicated advocate and champion of private entrepreneur in democracy, and particularly in Latin America, where he has worked for over 20 years. He's been in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. So, John, thank you, Angela. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. I would like to extend my thanks to the CIPE team, who have really worked, really, who has done an effort to organize this, and to the Chamber of Commerce of Bogota, also to Ipsos for conducting the poll that we will be uh, seeing today. And thank you to everyone participating to this event here in the room, and also joining us through our streaming. CIPE has been committed to this anti-corruption issues in Colombia for the last 20 years. And with the peace agreements that are so important for the country, we decided to establish an office here in Bogota. And we're very grateful to be able to be here and to work harder in these topics that we work on. I'm really excited and I'm really thankful for celebrating our first anniversary of being here, of our office here in Bogota. And it's thanks to the work of the very talented team that we've been able to continue to be here to celebrate this anniversary. I would also like to introduce our executive director Andrew Wilson, who who is here with us today, and also to the Ipsos team for the presentation of the results of the poll. I'm going to switch to English to introduce Andrew.
I would like to introduce our Executive Director at the Center for International Private Enterprise, Andrew Wilson. We're based in Washington, D.C. Andrew has great experience working with the private sector on these sorts of issues, development issues related to conflict and post-conflict settings. He's worked with crafting successful business strategies to reduce corruption and strengthening business advocacy, among many other themes. He is also called upon frequently to speak about linkages between democracy and private sector issues, as well as the challenges to growth in emerging markets like Colombia, including the challenges of corruption and the threat of corrosive capital. Andrew has worked at CIPE since 1996 in a variety of roles. He's been our Deputy Director for Strategic Planning and Programs, and also was Regional Director for Europe and Asia. Prior to his time at CIPE, Andrew worked for a number of years in development organizations, focusing on economic reform, private sector growth, and public diplomacy. So we're really happy to present Andrew to give us his perspectives on this survey and the challenges that we face in democracy in the world. Thanks, Andrew.
I feel so tall standing on this platform. John was up to here. Well, good morning, everybody, and it's nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces here today. And thank you very much, John, for the introduction. And I want to take this opportunity as we get started to thank the staff of our CIPE Colombia office for setting up, really, I think it's one of our first events that we're doing, sort of mixed hybrid event that we're doing here at CIPE. And perhaps this is a wave of the future for us, but also the tremendous staff from our Washington, D.C. staff who've also been putting together this project and also doing the hard work with Ipsos and others on defining the work of this survey and this program. And I'm really excited to be here today to review that with you and to learn more about it. I also want to just give a quick briefing or a brief hello to our colleagues who are joining us online. We know there are many of you out there, and we hope you find this presentation engaging as well. I'd like to thank the Bogota Chamber of Commerce and the ICC for hosting us and joining us today, and to welcome our partners, Ron Rivadeneira of the Quito Chamber of Commerce and Eduardo Herrera of Peru's Private Anti-Corruption Council for also making the trip in. You know, the ICC is a global partner of CIPE, and it's always exciting to be working with ICC no matter where we go. We've actually been doing work with the ICC here in Colombia on trade programs under another guise called the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation, which we're very proud to be working with. I want to thank all the international organizations, local partners, members of the press and diplomatic corps, and Colombian friends for your presence here today. And I'd also like to give a special thanks to the National Endowment for Democracy, whose funding made this program possible and who has been a steadfast supporter of CIPE and our work in Colombia and in Latin America in general for many years. What we're going to do today is to present the survey results from more than 2,000 entrepreneurs in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. We're going to be joined by the renowned research firm, as you've already heard, Ipsos, which has extensive experience working on transparency issues in Latin America, and who has given us their expertise in this program. You know, a lot of water has passed under the global bridge since my last visit to Colombia in April 2018. 2+ years of grappling with COVID-19, And just when we thought things were going back to normal, Russia invaded Ukraine and I think turned the world on its head once again. And certainly in the Andean region, things have not been static either. In addition to coping with pandemic and absorbing the impact of Russia's war, the region has faced profound challenges to ensure the continuity of democracy. Social protest is an integral part of democracy, but I think it's fair to say that it has challenged the administrations of the Andean countries. To their credit, all three countries where we've been working in this project have upheld the right to protest, even as they have sought solutions to the crises they are confronting. And at CIPE, we understand that successful democracies are those that survive political transitions peacefully, even when a substantial shift of political viewpoints is involved. None of our democracies is perfect, and I can speak to you that with humility on that. They cannot work, but the work of democracy is never finished, and I think we all understand that to a great degree. You know, I'm reminded of what the U.S. civil rights leader, John Lewis, who passed away last year, said about democracy. It's not a state, but it is an act. And as such, we all need to do our part. At CIPE, we've been doing our part for almost 40 years now. Over these years, we've supported many partners across the world with the belief that political and economic freedoms are both crucial to the successes of democracies. From CIPE's first grant, awarded in this region to Hernando de Soto and his Institute for Liberty and Democracy in Peru, to our current work in Colombia's PADET programs, we have placed private entrepreneurship at the center of our Latin American strategies and programs. That's why this event and programs like CIPE's anti-corruption program are so important. The Andean Regional Anti-Corruption Program is CIPE's answer to the Odebrecht corruption scandals and the weaknesses that COVID laid bare concerning public procurement processes. Both Odebrecht and COVID resulted in serious institutional challenges to the Andean region's democracies. And in Colombia, it triggered a social upheaval that shook the administration of Iván Duque. This program reflects CIPE's core beliefs. Yes, elections are crucial, but sound public policies are equally vital to the success of democracies. While sound public procurement policy can seem like an arcane subject matter, and believe me, I've been working on public procurement for many years, and it does take a certain stomach to keep working on the issues. It's vitally important to the success of a democracy and building strong blocks of governance within a country. When public projects are awarded to only a few connected companies through obscure procurement practices, trust in democracy declines, endangering its long-term survival. In my own region where I used to work in Russia, how corruption and cronyism undermined the economy and stifled the dreams and aspirations of Russian entrepreneurs went on for 2 decades, and we're seeing the outcomes of that sort of action. And it's really alarming, according to the 2021 Latino Barometro program, that only 27% of Colombians, 28% of Ecuadorians, and 32% of Peruvians think that corruption has been reduced in the past 2 years. And that's where the private sector comes in. To further democratic growth, we need the power of collective action on the part of businesses, including multinational corporations and small and medium enterprises, because we're all in the same value chains now, to help define the right sort of procurement processes to be put in place. Corruption is a disease that undermines the ability of states to reform, fair competition to exist, and ethical investment to flow. The private sector must be a partner with government and civil society in efforts to create environments that counter corruption and reward honesty. To that end, our program has worked with the International Chamber of Commerce's representatives in Colombia and Ecuador, and the Anti-Corruption Private Council of Peru, together with the polling firm Ipsos, to improve public procurement by incorporating the private sector's input. We hope that the recommendations you hear today will serve to strengthen democracy in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, and we'd like to see democracy delivering for all the citizens of these countries. You know, when CIPE opened its Colombia office 2 years ago, we had exactly this kind of project in mind, where the private and public sector come together to address shared challenges. This event is a testament of what CIPE can do to build resilient democratic institutions, and we look forward to partnering with you and participating with you in future actions under this program. Thank you very much, muchas gracias, and I would like now to hand the podium back to Angela, who will get the program moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for your words. Next, we would like to invite Felipe Castro, Director of Public Affairs of Ipsos, who is going to present the results of the survey on transparency in public contracting that was conducted to over 2,000 entrepreneurs of Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, and he will also give a review. Felipe Castro is an economist of the Javeriana University. He has a master in public management from London School of Economics. He's an expert in design, execution, monitoring, and assessment of public policies in countries. We would like to invite Felipe to join us here at the podium. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. I would like to start by thanking SAIPE for inviting us to be part of this project. So we would like to extend a special greeting to Andrew Wilson and Angela Maria Vélez for this podium that makes me look taller than I really am. And I would also like to thank the Chamber of Commerce, to Anna, who always has her doors open for a discussion, for something that's so important, so relevant for democracy. But beyond the issues, the presentation is going to be more focused on the recommendations. And I here connect with what Andrew was saying, that corruption has to be treated from a community, from a cooperative perspective. Sometimes corruption is only linked to the public sector, to the clerks, to the officers, but you also sometimes forget that there's a demand for corruption. And if we want to break that market of offer and demand of corruption, it's through collective action. And we need to address this problematic from a collective perspective. So I'm going to present the results of the study. It was a study that was conducted by Ipsos, in which I have the pleasure of presenting, but I didn't participate in it. I just become a part of Ipsos. So I would like to start by thanking Cristina Querubin, who was a former Director of Public Affairs, to Juan David Amazan, and also Maria Angelica Ospina, who were the people who worked on this study together with all the team of data collection from Ipsos, who allows us to present these important findings in order to be able to take action around corruption. The presentation is organized in these 4 items. So a brief introduction of the motivation behind the study. I think there's a consensus not only here in the room but in the region regarding corruption here and the cost to democracy from corruption. Then I will talk a little bit on how the study was conducted. We've mentioned the data, the survey, but we also have a methodology that most of you that are here today participated in creating those recommendations. They invested important time, significant time around those results in order to develop roadmaps on that specific collective action. And then I will close on that with the recommendations. There's a lot. It's a working document. And we were talking that what's important is that when we leave here today, we start working on those actions, the incorporation of this roadmap for the new Colombian administration, the new government. How can we make corruption a priority in the governments of the three countries? So we have some general recommendations, but we also have some detailed recommendations that are specific to each country. This graph is tells you a lot about corruption and our inability as a society to solve those issues. If we see the trend, that we could go further backwards. But the five things that most worry us, corruption has always been there, above inflation, above which now due to the situation a little bit above. But corruption is always there with violence, crime, and it's something that doesn't disappear. We've seen how 7 years ago it was the thing that worried us the most as citizens, and with the pandemic precisely, the first semester of 2020 was something that came to a public light and generated all those social insatisfaction in different countries of the region. It started in Chile, then it went to Peru, Ecuador, and finally reached Colombia. And it's been a process in which that trust is broken between citizens and the institutions. All it's due to corruption practices. Whether this is a global trend, but in this trend that we do regarding corruption, in political corruption and financial corruption, two of the countries that are object of study, Colombia and Peru, are within the countries where people worry the most about in the world. Ecuador is not included in this survey. Probably if we had included Ecuador, it would also be among the first places, first spots. It's a critical to society, but specifically or more importantly to our region. It's something that worries the people in the region, and it affects how society uh, relates to the public sector. So the goal of this study, beyond diagnosing a problem that we already know that exists, is to focus on developing tools for that specific problem. What is it that we have to do as society, specifically the private sector, to address this issue as a co-responsibility, co-accountability, because the accountability doesn't lie only in the public sector, and see how we can take specific actions. That's why we didn't stop at the poll. We're going to see some results. We're not going to stay with the. We're going to see the picture, but then we will see the roadmaps that were detailed uh, for each country. So this is not a consultant. This is not a work from a consultant that jumps to say how is it that you solve the problems. This is the result of a work in which entrepreneurs participated in diagnosing and identifying and specific actions to solve this problematic. So we will start with the picture because the survey was the starting point. It was a survey that we conducted in three countries. And we surveyed not only small but also medium and big entrepreneurs from different sectors. So we included service, trade, and manufacturing sectors. So it's a private sector that also hires or contracts with the governments. Those were the filters that we used for the surveys, so that the person who was filling the survey would knew it was important that the person filling the survey knew about public contracting. Then we did a, a discussion with conducting a seminar where we show the results. We hand some information to understand corruption, and we use material that was provided by SIPE, and we wanted to give participants additional elements that from those results find lines of actions in order to fight corruption. and find a solution for this problem. And we're now socializing. Today we're presenting the study. Here's where we start the hard work, the big effort of bring this information to decision-making spaces in the different governments so that it can land on specific concrete actions. This process of taking the results from the service was really valuable. That exercise was really valuable because once again, these roadmaps allows us to identify actions so that we can address the government and we can tell the government what actions can be conducted on behalf of the government, but also on behalf of the private sector in order to achieve what Andrew was mentioning, which is the collective action. So now let's jump into the results. This picture shows you what we were mentioning, and Andrew was doing special emphasis on this, which is that corruption has not decreased over time. On the contrary, there's the perception that it's always more present and more prevalent. In the case of Colombia, we had data from 20 years ago from a baseline, and the behavior is exactly the same. So around 70%, 65% of the people consider that corruption has grown. So it's a problematic that we haven't really achieved to break it, and it's still current for the last 20 years in our society. The other thing that this picture shows is that corruption for the three countries is more linked to the high roles rather than to local environments. And this is really important because when you're asking people on corruption and their perception, the way in which they judge the relation with corruption is determined by their action space. So the corrupt people are really far from me, and that's an explanation that might explain this trend in which we see that we have the national sphere and it might have levels, higher levels compared to what a person does in their city or the immediate context.
The second thing is that there is a co-responsibility in the payment of bribes in terms of public recruitment, and that's very important because it's not only a deliberate action from the public worker, uh, but there's also some employers that recognize that in the market, the companies offer uh, every now and then some type of bribes to be able to access some public positions. Um, so this is a scenario that's kind of the same in all the countries. It's something that we see along the whole presentation, and it's more or less that 1 out of 10 employers consider that there is some type of perception, consider the private sector what induces or motivates these type of practices for corruption. So this is very important because it's some data that shows us and it quantifies somehow this co-responsibility. The other element is as well that corruption is somehow linked as some type of rule for the game of public recruitment. So in the case, for example, of Ecuador or Peru, 28% of the surveyed people know ahead that if they access to some type of process that it is part of the rules of the game, there has to be some type of corruption so that they can access to some type of public position. In Colombia, it's higher. 42% of people know that if they get into these type of processes, there is some sort of corruption. So, for example, if I'm going to participate in a party and there's some type of ethics and clothing setting, I am responsible of this type of rules, game rules that are imposed. So this starts showing some type of um, tolerance and some permission around these topics surrounding corruption. It's not only something about corruption, but it's also part of this corruption as all in all of these processes. This is a very important data. It's one of the most interesting findings that we have seen, and it's something that we have also been looking for in order to quantify the cost of corruption. In Colombia, at some point, we spoke about that corruption costed the country around like 50 billion pesos. This was a number that appeared in many headlines, but it's very difficult to talk about this number specifically in this exercise. The workers were talking about some hiring recruitment process, and where they were saying what the percentage of the contract that do you think is going to be paid for corruption or to access this type of contract, and there is not some type of tariff set amount like a 16%. In Colombia it was like 17%, Ecuador 16, Peru 14, and the average was 16. So in practical terms, it was some type of extra costs. In Colombia, the VAT is 19%. So you can assume that it's kind of an additional cost that the market public recruitment has, and something that from which we need to do this type of payment to be able to access to these contracts. If we do some type of some calculation to see what type of an annual recruitment value, we would see that the 17% is equal to around 25,000 million pesos, billion pesos. So this is part of the current tax reform that is being established in the Congress in Colombia currently. This is a value that is somehow affecting the taxes and the different part that the society needs to provide for the proper work of the public sector, and it's being seen as some inefficiency aspect. About tolerance, there are several data that the survey gives us that evidences what I was showing you before. Es que hay prácticas, and that is that there are some practices that are associated to corruption and that have some type of tolerance compared to how the businesses develop. So if we take a look at this 9-10% is something that we see repeated in this graphic, in this chart as well. Somehow, several companies have the possibility of accessing these processes, and there is some type of tolerance in front of the efficiency of corruption as mechanism to access some public positions. So this tolerance is highly associated to the cost, and that is if I start accessing to some type of licitation, public licitation process, we need to have implicitly the cost that will be generated by the corruption. In Colombia, there is a saying that from an ex-president that he was saying the corruption needs to be addressed to the proper its proper proportions, and they are associated to like the requirement of this level of corruption to be able to access to these processes and all these licitations to access public entities. There are some corruption situations. The worker does his work and somehow it's kind of justified. So particularly for this question, what we see is that approximately this 10% that again we see repeated, it evidences that there's some type of tolerance in this sense facing all the corruption topics. Besides this permission and this situation, you will see that there are some game rules. If I start participating in these public recruitment processes, I am also aware of the fact that I cannot change the rules. So it doesn't matter regardless if I put some lawsuits, if I do some type of claims, and there's no chance to change the game rules. So these results for Colombia, for Ecuador, for Peru, there's a percentage around the 20%. Uh, when the person refrains from giving lawsuits or putting claims about this type of attitudes that are not that are against proper competence and fair competence, uh, going against putting lawsuits or consulting with other type of companies for licitations. So basically, this type of claims and lawsuits is not a completely effective measurement to change this situation. The second thing is that these elements and decision-making situations are where the corruption situations happen are very particular and different for the different countries. In the case of Colombia, we have the expenses ordinance, which is when the person has the execution of the process, and in that sense, they can define the reference terms and the conditions on which this budget is going to be established. And during this process, during this recruitment process, there are some previous stages and some competence stages and assignment where these criteria and this corruption situation happens. In Colombia, we speak about an 18% of, for example, the amount of decisions that are taken around public recruitment can be exposed to corruption in the expense planning. This doesn't happen in Ecuador or Peru, where the higher percentage is in some other type of level, but not necessarily in the expense planning. So this is something that comes a bit above the ministry, the head of the entity, and so on, and not necessarily who makes the decision of the expenses itself. Um, Besides checking at these analysis, these studies show that we have been inefficient in fighting against corruption, and this inefficacy is highly associated to the advancements that have happened in all the countries. Everything regarding transparency in the information systems, SECOP in Colombia, in Peru, Peru Compras, and in Ecuador, SECROP. But in practical terms, all of these elements that have been the main advancements in terms of public recruitment, trying to make it more transparent and more efficient, though are not working very well. So there are several questions in terms of, for example, the electronic recruitment system. A bit more than half consider that it hasn't really helped to stop corruption, and on the other hand, it has helped to make the process more complicated. So it has been inefficient to stop corruption, and in the end, it makes the whole process more inefficient in terms of that the people that are hired in the end need to invest way more time to be able to fulfill of the adjustment that have been set. All these recruitment organizations or entities in the different countries, and also the unique recruitment of proponents or providers, the RUP in Colombia. If it's more than half consider that it hasn't been useful, it's been inefficient, and has made the process way more inefficient itself. There's another element that the study shows that is associated to this inefficacy to stop corruption, and that is the very little capacity that we have for sanctioning for people, both people and companies and public workers, in terms of setting some type of punishment to all of these anti-ethic activities and work activities from the workers. So the orange part is people who consider there is very little, it's unlikely that this type of anti-ethic actions, or these workers who commit any type of corruption actions um, can be punished properly, or that the companies who do some type of corruption activities can be punished. So we are inefficient at punishing corruption. There is another implicit cost in the development of corruption, and that is that there are some public resources that are being lost, mainly because we are not doing things in the best way we should. So one of the main central element so that we can make proper decisions is that we have better competence. So public recruitment has also to do with that. We need to set some kind of rules so that we have participation from different sectors and with the logic of the market, and me as a public worker facing what is best for me as the representative from the citizen. I'm going to provide the best goods and benefits at the lowest price possible. This is why the contracting and recruitment processes work for, and this is what it's looking for, and so we can make better decisions as well. So what's happening is precisely the opposite, and is that this fight against corruption and the idea that corruption is a practice that's socially tolerable in all of these public recruitment processes, it makes me to refrain from participating in all of these processes as a worker. So this shows all these processes in which corruption reduces competence, and particularly in Colombia, because in Ecuador it's less evidenced. In Colombia, 94% of company workers refrained from participating on any type of process because they knew that the process would be corrupted somehow. In Ecuador, 68% and 83% in the case of Peru. So this is an additional expense that corruption has, and that it affects the public value in general. The other thing is that there's some type of general consensus about thinking that the sometimes this is not the best proposition, the proposal. Sometimes it's more than 60%. This is a result that the three countries share, and they consider that very few times the person who gets these contracts is not usually the best proposal. So this is some type of inefficiency that shows that these public processes for public recruitment not only makes it to lose public uh, budget value, but there's some public value that's being lost because we're receiving inferior or not as good uh, uh, resources that are affecting the society in the end. So it's a double loss, not only for the private sector, but also in terms of the public value in general. Uh, Another element that this survey shows, and I'm going to finish with the data in a moment, so that I can move to the recommendations, is associated to activities that are not necessarily bribes, but that constitute some practices that are anti-ethic itself, like using politic contacts to access some type of licitation, or achieving in during the competitive process some type of anti-competitive processes to affect the company, or to have some influence in the terms of reference, so that in that way we can have some type of advantage, um, or that certain company or a certain sector has this advantage, or using some type of personal contacts inside of public institutions to increase the possibility of accessing a public contract. This is very important because this happens a lot, and it's another way of corruption. It's different from bribing, but different from this type of fee that is being paid, but it's some type of practice that is frequently used. Is what this chart shows, like 40% in most cases. Uh, that in it also has some type of impact for decreasing competence and not reaching the best proposals. Um, there are some other elements associated around here regarding some comparative aspects, but the conclusion is the same, saying that there are different ways of corruption. It's not only bribing, but there are some anti-ethic practices, anti-competitive practices that make the process bad, and that make us difficult to reach the best offer. So we're also in the same way we're seeing some aspects in which the corruption actions are justified in around like a 10% in most of the countries, in which in many cases, well, it's either corruption unjustified, but there are not social actions to condemn and punish this type of action. So there are practices that are used constantly to access all of these public contracts. So that's the kind of the whole picture of the study that we set. We try to be as summarized and as succinct as possible. As you can see, there are not so many differences between the countries. I would say Colombia maybe has some behaviors that are atypical, uh, like I signal, I pointed out, but it's a behavior that's generalized in the region, and it has many elements that I'm going to try to summarize a bit. So there's some type of complicity between the companies, institutions, and the public sector in terms of what corruption means, and there is a consensus in terms of the efficacy and fight against corruption. There's a consensus saying that the whole fight against corruption has made the process more inefficient in the end. And there are some cultural elements in which we see some important tolerance facing these corruption actions. I would say these are the four headlines or the four main aspects that this survey gave us, and that would allow us to have some important picture, not only to measure the perception, but also to know exactly where we can break this vicious cycle. Because these four elements that I mentioned are basically just a vicious cycle, because the offer and the demand of corruption has gotten into some type of balance, and we have seen some type of like in the provider unique registry, the RUP. So the recommendations did that. They gathered this information, they analyzed the whole picture, and they started trying to land on how to break this vicious cycle for of corruption. I am going to show you some general conclusions that we reached, what we established as the roadmap in general, and these elements are going to be available through CIPE so that you can consult it. And I think that these roadmaps can be useful to take some actions and to do some collective action. At this point, I'm going to just set some findings, and for every country we have around 21, 22 recommendations, very concrete, so that we can break this vicious cycle that the general picture from the survey showed us. These five elements are some common elements in the three countries. The first one is related to strengthening and promotion of the use of platforms and digital resources. It's a condition that's necessary but not sufficient. It means that we need to expand the coverage in terms of like public purchases. In Colombia, for example, SECOP, in Peru, Peru Compras. And besides strengthening and widening this coverage, it's important to check the capacity of these systems so that they do not become an obstacle for the contracting process. We need more transparency, more better actions, but this cannot affect the whole recruitment process. The second recommendation is regarding the impunity that we see to these corruption actions. First, we need to take some more actions, is kind of what the society has been looking for. And in the presidential campaign in Colombia, the second person who was like next to after Petro, his flag was basically fighting corruption, fighting corrupt politicians, and this is an element that in which we need some sanctions that actually have some consequence when a corruption activity happens. But something that happened as well is that we need stimuli. We also need some type of pricing so that we can have some good prices for companies that have good competitive activities and good practices, and to kind of award these type of workers who set some competitive practices. So this is a way in which we need stronger sanctions for bad practices, but we need to also do some type of breaking this cycle in which we award good practices in the same regard. The next aspect in this practice, anti-corruption practice, What we see that is not limited only to bribing, but also anti-ethic practices in which, for example, there are personal contacts or some practices between competitors, in which, and also what we understand for corruption itself is not only, for example, stealing the budget from a road, from a highway, but, for example, passing a traffic light, or paying something to not to get a ticket. So we see that there are certain degrees of corruption, and I think in terms of training, formation, education, it's some more midterm measurement, but it's also important. Also, what they were saying is was a bigger participation from the company sector, uh, also because they in like this recruitment from this sector, we need to check when these sets are published. There's a sector in which there are some type of comments, but there's not a feedback section in which the public entities are able to hear or listen to its workers so that the practice is more competitive. I had the opportunity to be a public worker some years ago, and I was contracting some evaluation parts, and it was a very important market. It was a reduced market, maybe 10, 15 proposals. And when we did that, I remember like a meeting similar to this one, in which I, as the organizer of the expenses, I was kind of setting some suggestions. They were not landing at a specific project, uh, not a specific type of contest. I don't like not looking for any type of advantage, considering the aspects of every company. But if we see it from outside and we check the spaces of listening to the business sector, and we see it in a more transversal way, it's a nice way to improve this participation. And last, the regulations. Uh, the regulations aspect is a very complex situation. We see that public recruitment is an art, but it needs to be a transparent art enough so that we can all have the same capacities for interpretation and to reduce a subjective point of view. This was something that was said per country, but in that sense, it's important to continue in these simplification processes to advance in some regulation that's clear, in which we can see with discretion, and so that we can advance on these efficacy measurements, so that we see that corruption or the risks for corruption are reduced and we don't generate bigger inefficiencies. So this is very important because, as we saw in the picture, the fight against corruption generates some inefficiency, and we generate a vicious cycle around these processes. I think I extended a bit longer than the time I had, but there are three very punctual recommendations for every country. Um, as I was saying in the document, we see the detail for every country, more than 20 recommendations, but this is a way to highlight some of the elements that I mentioned generally, but that for every country have some type of particularity. So in the case of Colombia, it's very important about the competent authority to have like a manual for good practices. This is associated not only thinking about punishing and trying to make the process more inefficient, but trying to highlight good practices that allow to reduce the risk of corruption. The second recommendation goes in the same line in these matrices, uh, in all of the participants of this process, that they were kind of requiring the idea of mapping all of these corruption risks that go beyond all of these resources exchange, or as we say in Colombia, coimas, to reduce all of these aspects. And there are risks, corruption risks, that are socially accepted, and those are inefficient as well, and they generate some type of problems as well in terms of public decision making. So we require these type of spaces to build all of these matrices and these grids. In Colombia, we think about efficient purchases, also in the business sectors as well. And it's very important that the business sector gets organized and looks for spaces, not for intervention itself, but spaces to generate this collective action, precisely to make these recruitment processes more effective. So now in the case of Peru, there's a very specific need in terms of the incentives. We were also seeing that in the general recommendations. It's important that this adds to the process, the qualification processes. For example, delivering certifications or scores to the companies that do some type of deep analysis of the recruitment processes, and they require some type of active action from them to break this cycle as well. It's also very important to set some type of reference terms and that are more specific and more precise, as I was saying, to reduce the subjective point of view and to set some clear game rules. And in terms of the platform itself, there were some recommendations regarding the information and the history of the information, so that it's possible to have some type of bigger coverage and to have some information going back. And finally, in the case of Ecuador, the recommendations are going or looking more are more oriented into looking to improve the access to information, to be able to have more centralized processes, also to have some uh, deep analysis processes from the businesses and from the sectors. There's very little motivation for setting lawsuits, but this is not translated in concrete actions. So these things, this type of analysis, we need to check on this to be more efficient as well. And lastly, in terms of education and culture, focusing mostly on companies and workers to be able to improve the capacities for recruitment, to have more knowledge, to have a better asymmetry with the information, to know how the public recruitment works, and that way to generate spaces to decrease these risks of corruption. So that's basically the study. I think it's very valuable. Once again, I thank CIP for the opportunity that they gave us as a firm to do this type of analysis. And this allows us to understand why corruption has been historically a problem and why it's so complex, this collective action process, because there are no concrete mechanisms or actions to break this vicious cycle around the permission and the tolerance against corruption. And I think that this allows us to think a little bit forward into some concrete actions, precisely for the business sector and for the all other type of group sectors, in entities of the three countries, to be able to check and see all of these findings and to put them into some type of practice. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope this was of your enjoyment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Felipe, for the presentation and your comments on the survey. Now we will have a panel on the efforts and challenges for a transparent procurement with the government. It's going to be moderated by Vanessa de la Torre. She's a journalist from the Javeriana University. She has a master in Latin America Studies from Georgetown University. She has worked as a journalist, presenter, and director in chains such as CNN, CMI, Telefe, Coavisa, Radio Caracas, Unitel, Caracol Television, and Blue Radio. She's author of the book Histories of Love in the Field of War. Currently, she's director of 10 a.m. Hoy por Hoy, a program from Caracol Radio. We would like to invite Juan Rivadeneira, Executive Director from the Chamber of Commerce of Quito, Ana Maria Ferguson, VP of Public-Private Articulation Department of the CCB, and Eduardo Herrera, Director of the Private Center for Anti-Corruption in Peru. Well, thank you very much for being here today. August 18th is a very important day for Colombians because if you don't, in case you don't know, it's the anniversary of the murder of Luis Carlos Galan Sarmiento, which is really important, was really important for our country. And we've always had that question if that generation of men and women did uh, that did politics in Colombia during the 80s, what could have they achieved if they hadn't been murdered? So, as a journalist, for me, it's really important to act on corruption because I see so many cases of corruptions that I have to see how to navigate that. Because if I see 20 cases, I have to decide which one should I do. And you have one, I know, a Butman's office, a general attorney's office here, and there are a lot of things going on there. And the results of the survey leave you really heartbroken. And as a journalist, I really suffer. There are a lot of there are several data that's really important. First, the 25,000 billion pesos uh, that is lost because of corruption, and this is just stealing the future from kids. And that's one of my obsessions with the students' food services. And we all know that that's being stolen. And in La Guajira department, something that happens, and it's the inability of the Colombian state in order to control these corruption problems. And once you look at the comparison of 20 years ago, the survey 20 years ago, and the survey nowadays, it seems as if nothing has happened in terms of corruption. That's why it's so interesting to be here with you to learn, to reflect, to think. In the case of Peru, with Odebrecht, gave us a lot of lessons. And what is it that makes Latin America such a corrupt place? Because it doesn't happen in, let's say, Japan or Sweden. So why is it that we're not doing something there? Because there's not enough of us when we're conducting journalistic investigations on corruption. It seems as if this thing would be an integral part of our country. So I would like to start by with you, if you could share a little bit on your thoughts on the information that we were just given. And I want to make this a discussion. I want to have reflections and discussions that hopefully will become lessons that will stick to us. So Ana Maria, go ahead, ladies first, please. Well, Vanessa, thank you very much. And yes, you were saying it's a memorable day for the country. So from the Chamber of Commerce, we've started thinking, what's that new DNA that all companies should have? So it's not just isolated acts that I have an anti-corruption policy or I have certain measurements for control. And that's why we have been working since last year with the OCDE in developing responsible entrepreneurial behavior. So this organization has been working with different companies so that what's the role that you play on society? It's not just how do you generate value, how do you generate wealth, how do I have a bigger reach on the market, but how can I do all these things in a responsible manner? And when we ask ourselves, what does it mean to be responsible? There's something at the center, which is due diligence. One of those aspects that at the center of this thing, it's anti-corruption. How is it that in all the processes that I start delving into, any procurement, any contracting, any hiring with other companies, with the state, I must have certain inner controls that can guarantee that on my side I'm playing and I'm following the rules of the game, and I'm also following the demands of society. So the conceptual framework is basically that's what we've been working on. So you shouldn't be working on yourself in terms of anti-corruption and transparency. Juan, well, thank you, Vanessa. I would just ask to do a first intervention that I think is really important because August 18th, if I'm not mistaken, here in Colombia, you're celebrating the fight against corruption, and I think it's formidable uh, for the presentation of this study. Second, I would like to congratulate SciPy Ipsos for the study. So they already present a baseline of almost 20 years. And those of us who work in the public sector, we know that when you build a timeline, and you will, it's the only way in which you can understand if your measurements have worked or not. So this is a new mark. Now the question would be, when is the new survey coming to see if the actions will work or not? The third thing that I would like to mention is I would like to highlight the value, the worth of the study, because the study is precisely trying to find where the gaps are and how is it that we can bridge them. And the task is the reduction of the gaps, the bridge of the gaps, and it's also important to highlight that the study focuses on transparency. And I think that transparency it's a good starting point for the presentation of this study. Now, I think that there are many different points. So regarding the technical side of things, the sample size, I think to have 750 cases per country, I think Ecuador has 750 samples. This makes it a really robust study, and I think this gives makes it significant so that you can start taking public policy measurements. If we were having an initial conversation with the public hiring authority, they have really they've shown a lot of interest in this study from the Ecuadorian part. And I'm going to jump ahead a little bit on the conclusion, which is how is it that we can make it not an ends but a means? When I mentioned this project, this study has to be means so that we can start taking action in our countries. And there might be some data that are really, there might be some data that's really important. And when you start crossing those data, and, and you find out that something, for instance, 84% of the entrepreneurs that were surveyed think that things haven't changed, makes it a more complex. Uh, Makes you think that maybe the actions that have been taken have not really worked. Then you have to start thinking on the mentality in corruption and how you can take action on it. And when you start asking, where should we go? What should we do? There's no really knowledge. You really don't know what to do. So it's a change of institutions that must work together and must also be subscribed to the judicial, to the legal power, because here's where you will find and you will boost, you promote that these entrepreneurs can really materialize this action, because then we just end up thinking about it and not doing anything about it. That would be my first intervention. And I really think that the most important data for us, for entrepreneurs, is to understand that in Ecuador, 32% of the people that were surveyed point out that they have integrity policy manual. And when you understand that only 3 out of 10 have an integrity policy manual, then you start wondering, maybe that's just a book. Uh, and what are the rest of the entrepreneurs doing? The other 70%, what are they doing? And the other task that we have as entrepreneurs is to uh, create education regarding compliance and integrity policies. That's what we're trying to do from the Chamber of Commerce of Quito, to understand that 7 out of 10 entrepreneurs don't have a tool to manage compliance and to have integrity in the policies, which is fundamental for the collective action to address. And that's what I would like to say initially. Before we jump to Eduardo, I would like to ask you a question. So, how common is corruption in Quito? Because in Colombia, people take it for granted. So, whenever you hear a radio program in the morning, in 15 in a 15-minute period, how many times do you hear the word corruption? It's it becomes part of the landscape, even when we know that it's not right. Is it the same thing in Quito? Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, the problem is when you start normalizing the behavior. When you see that 82%, I think it's necessary to make things move, as we say here in Latin America. So in order to jumpstart things, you need 82% people think that it's necessary. And the second thing is to understand that 70% of people normalize it, know that the corrupt act exists, and it's normal. And there's another thing that we say here in Latin America, which is we don't care that they steal as long as they do something, as they show results. Yeah, that's a common phrase here in Colombia. Look, they stole money from a school, but they built a school. That's a problem because a big effort that we have to do is to change that mentality. Is not It shouldn't be normal that we shouldn't justify corruption. There's no justification, and we have to promote. That's the biggest challenge on the private sector that we have. Well, good morning, everyone. I have some notes that I've taken, and I would like to start with something that I always say. We only worry about corruption when it's not our corruption, when it doesn't has to do with us. And you can see that in the results of the survey. In Peru, we call it a ring. Here's a gear. So, like, yeah, a circle regarding its inner circles. And whenever someone asks where is the corruption, everyone says, no, it's not me. It's over there. It doesn't. Corruption doesn't have to do with me. And it's a big drama in Latin America, and it's a lot about the problem. And because it's their problem, I don't have anything to do there. It's not part of me to be part of the solution. And so it becomes a problem for everyone, but no one's responsible. Second thing that I would like to mention is that corruption is not a problem. It's a symptom of something behind, and that we don't want to see. So if there's corruption in politics, it's like, yeah, you're stealing, but you're making. It just goes to show mediocrity. We uh, so yeah, if we put our heads down and we accept and we vote and we say that all the politicians are corrupt, then we don't have nothing to do there. All right. So public procurement is something that has been left behind. In our country, we have a saying is, if you know how I get, then why do you keep inviting me? We have abandoned really public procurement and public contracting. Entrepreneurs have flee from public procurement and they've left that to merchants. They don't believe in free entrepreneur, and they just go around looking for opportunities, and they see corruption as something that is profitable. We also think that we have a real devotion on law, and we have this conception that once you have the law, then everything that makes everything change. And so law, when it's a bureaucracy, generates corruption opportunities, because many laws, a lot of people create a parallel way of acting. And here's, for instance, COVID rules. In Peru, you had certain rules that said, for instance, only men go out one day and the other day women go out. Or maybe you things such as you need to keep a 2 meter space between people. Why? Why that? People started questioning that, and when you start generating the rules and laws in a way that it's, let's say, that creates paranoia, or that become create fear. So yeah, the law is written down on the desk of a policymaker. Not It's not being written from the bottom of the pyramid. Another another example: queues, lines. You don't need a law for that. It's a standard that we've seen everywhere around the world, and you know that you need to stay in queue, you need to do the line, and when you jump the line, it's seen as a corruption act. So norms are basically not, laws are not basically the solution. I don't like compliance. I'm a lawyer. I don't believe too much. I know what I believe is that compliance has become too much about statistics and a checklist, and that generates bureaucracy, and that only leads to people jumping over lines and rules and all that. Compliance only works when there's enforcement. That means when you make the law something real and something that you can surveil and police. And we need someone constantly policing people so that they do the right thing until there's a mindset change and we become an ethical society. And I want to ask you specifically about Odebrecht, because what Peru really done was an example for the rest of Latin America. And I mention it because it's a case that, in one way or another, we all know it. It affected the whole of Latin America. But in Peru, the research and the investigations was outstanding. Look, to be honest, they weren't really that impressive. Well, when you compare it to what happened in Colombia, yeah. Look, they weren't that impressive. And why? And I'm going to give you real figures. Peru started really well. They did a really good initial job because they sent a president to jail. He's now free. They sent a politician to jail. She's now free. A lot of clerks and officers were sent to jail, but they didn't really have trials, and now they're free. So it started really well. They had an anti-corruption team that started to become ideological and started to think that justice was payment. And yeah, it's just what happened in Brazil with Moro. Like, look, he look, when justice is not strong, like, I mean, when justice starts falling. Look, in Peru, we don't have a single trial in terms of in regarding Odebrecht, and the general attorney's office just tried to act really quick. They were just trying to make it was a PR thing. They didn't they didn't conduct to a trial. Yeah, no. In terms, I mean, the journalists did a really good effort over there. And yeah, Odebrecht was really, yeah, we should be embarrassed with this Odebrecht case. Now, I would like to ask you about the Latin American phenomenon. Why that that conniveness, that being conniving, it's is it a particular Latin American phenomenon? Yeah, there's a saying. It's like think. Well, there's a saying, think bad and you will succeed. So at least in Peru, with the government that we have, you can clearly see it. Corruption has always been there. What happened is that it used to be more discreet, more sophisticated, more elegant. Now it's just there in your face. It's we have a president with 6 investigations. Her daughter is running away from the justice, and his 2 nephews are jailed. So what happens is that in Latin America, corruption is more democratic, more inclusive. In other countries, it's more elegant, more sophisticated. It doesn't mean that there's no corruption. The thing is that we don't see it, and we get that impression. But there are countries that are really high in their high horses, and there's no corruption, but you see money laundering scandals over there, and that's corruption. Ana Maria, the question is, why should Colombian entrepreneurs have really run away from public procurement? Because we saw it in the survey, but why? What's the reason behind that? Well, Vanessa, thanks for that question, because it comes also from what we're talking about, the processes and the obstacles to conduct certain processes. So in order to create a partnership with any public organization, I'm going to have to do a lot of work, and it's a big, big effort to start doing this. For instance, to request a permit to work. We have been working with different entities, with the national government, so that the entrepreneurial activity doesn't get filled with all those requirements. That the more bureaucracy there is, the more that I try to go around it, as Eduardo was mentioning. And regarding public contracting, this is one of the biggest challenges. And companies, small and medium and micro companies, start seeing all the SECOV system as something that it's a big challenge, it's a big barrier, not a friendly tool, not it's difficult how to sign. I'm not going to be called, I'm not going to have the opportunities. And what that does is that a lot of the entrepreneurs don't see the opportunities for a market that it's a constant market and that it's a really important market and that has a lot of money that could help them basically grow. And what we've been trying to implement are bridges so that the companies really know what are the procedures, that working with state companies, we've been trying to reduce the processes in order to start working with these government agencies. And if there's more participation, if it's not always the same five that are always winning the bids, then you're going to reduce the risk of concentration and corruption, right? Yeah, even with all those requirements, how much autonomy does a clerk has to determine which contract, which bid they give to a bidder? For instance, I've been conducting an investigation with the military. Everything that any contract from any single contract from the military is a lot of money, a lot, thousands of millions of pesos, and every single day, because there's a big disconformity in the armed forces. My producer is there; she can testify to it. Every day, I'm getting calls from ex-general, policeman. Look, who wants to tell me, look, that guy did a public bidding, and it's always the same company that wins. So I'm asking, is this a decision of the general in turn, but does this apply to any other governmental entity? Is it a change? Is it a change that leads some? Well, the survey says a lot. Look, more than half of the answers is corruption is comes from the top down. Yeah, there's certain incidents in the different departments, but the perception is that the heads on top are the ones who are leading on corruptions. So I think the more controls that you have, there's going to be more transparency. But if, as I was, if there's not a zero tolerance policy regarding this, and where you can demonstrate that there are consequences to the actions, because what you were saying is really important. Look, there was really quick action, but then that didn't lead to anything. So until we change that, there's not going to be a real change. And there's also something really complex in the country. I've also had the opportunity to work in the public sector, and there are mafias involved in corruption, and they're really dangerous. And there's a lot of fear regarding denouncement. How is it that you can denounce a case? How is it that you can say, look, this is happening? And then, how committed is the Guillermo Lasso administration committed to this? Well, this is a really good question. It's an administration that's been for a year in power, and I would say that there are a lot of there are a lot of things that leads us to worry a little bit because the first day, the day of possession, the president signed a decree that was really weird. Why was it that a president was signing on their first day a decree? It was an initiative that was really important. I think it just marked the tone of the government in terms of promoting a care, at least in the executive branch, on how is it that clerics and officers on that branch uh, develop their actions and activities. Then we saw a series of initiatives with international cooperation to promote anti-corruption policies. He has even named a secretary that to address the corruption. But I think that the problem goes beyond what many think and believe, because the capabilities of the states are limited to control. Now, I agree with what was saying the last question. It's really important. Now, I would like to highlight the importance of leadership, because yeah, if the survey is telling you that 70% of people have the notion that the corruption comes top down, but yeah, that's a fact. So when the leader, when the minister, when the president, when the general, when the leader has this type of behavior, we cannot expect that the rest of the change behave in a different way. I think it's really important, the public exemplary. This is something that is very relevant, and not only in the public sector but also in the private sector, precisely to promote this working environment, this comprehensive framework to fight corruption. And look, that here in Colombia, we had a referendum against anti-corruption and we lost. Yeah, it was really politicized, but it was really interesting. So in Peru's case, this current government, what messages are being given? I think what Ivan Velasquez case in Colombia, uh, it says a lot, because what the guy has always done is denounce corruption, and he did it in Guatemala, in El Salvador. That was his proposal, and in the armed forces, there's a lot of corruption. So I don't know if I think that symbol is really important. So in Peru, what's the picture?
The government in Peru is very committed to all of these corruption cases, and it's part of some hypotheses I would like to mention and clarify briefly. There is some impression in Latin American governments, especially saying that the party that wins has the right to fulfill all the spaces in the state. So basically, naming ministries of their trust, not of the population's trust, and this is a very important element. Um, so when the state is seen as some type of treasure and some type of prize, with the Latin American states, with the presidential bands, and we're courtesan countries, and we cause that that the presidents believe that they have the ability and the possibility to take all the money. There are, for example, in Peru, there are 26 government members, and 25 are charged with corruption charges and cases. So yesterday, they found out that the general attorney received a bribe from the president. So this is a big problem. And with this, I would like to set a question and an answer at the same time. The politician sector and power doesn't have much to do against corruption. They have to demonstrate with their actions that there's transparency and that there is a law. They need to show that there's transparency, there's trust, reliability, responsibility. There's no law for that. There's an ethic law for the public sector, and this an absurd thing. It's something that doesn't really work. And the second thing is that when we believe that the president is someone who fights against corruption, is we're lost. The president needs to govern, and he needs to allow others to kind of check on him, like to see the prosecution, the attorneys. And in the U.S., there's an equilibrium, there's a balance of power. There's very little room for impunity. In our countries, we are hoping for like a very big leader, messiah, who brings us out of the problems and who fights all the corruption. Well, actually, regarding that, we are voting the different attorney, and this week it was a whole problem. Um, Controller to select the controller, they did a whole bunch of things so that the final list of the 10 members, the list should have been from the list from the last government. So they did a whole bunch of maneuvers, and there were two candidates, one openly supported by the government, and another candidate, a woman highly linked to the controller office, who's leaving. Um, I was actually in that this morning. That's why it took a little longer to arrive here. So the conservatives ended up supporting the different the candidate from the opposition. So he after a week from the new um, positioning of the president with the controller office. So this is something that hasn't been voted. The voting it goes now at 11 a.m. But it really called my attention and brings my attention that the president should not govern with his people, but with who is the best option for the people. In Latin America, well, it's something that happens a lot. The cabinet from the team from the people is something that we see, and we see that they advanced. And if for example, if they put if the person who deliver all the different pamphlets, and in Peru, for example, I think that there should be some type of psychoanalytic therapy, because the power shows that the citizens choose kind of gods, and only minors, like minors need leaders. So if we're looking for some type of leader that brings us out of this problem, but the problem is ours. For example, I have been 20 years in the justice system. I retired 7 years ago because it was very, very corrupt, and I was part of that corruption. I wrote a book about that. So it's not like like pointing out to the other. I need to start by myself, and I think that everyone should do some type of like moral humility. I did corruption. I like attorneys, judges, corruption, for cases. That's in a book actually. So that was a real thing, and it's not like I'm a victim of fate. I am someone who is completely responsible. I'm an older person, grown up, and they were telling me like incentives, money, yeah, just to gain and to win, like court cases. And this is something that happens very often in the justice system. I'm not saying anything that's new. So how many of us do our own corruption actions in our own lives? So the day that we take and we are aware of those type of things, is like I am part of the solution because I am part of the problem. Well, I think that your awareness changed a lot, but did it change in some other ways? Yeah, there was like a declination, there was a change. I retired, there was a protocol said, um, well, with legitimacy. I know the justice system, and we are in this fight against corruption. Um, so, Ana Maria, how responsible do the Colombian president feel against corruption? Do they feel that they support? Do they foster? Do they push for this against these corruption cases? Well, we have a survey for kind of like business climate, and we have an aspect in which we ask them, what tools do you know against corruption? How much do you do trainings and these type of things? And more or less in those three axes, companies do not have any type of actions for that, and that shows how they don't see that. And that's why I was saying at the beginning, like trying to put this inside of the DNA, and they don't see this as part of their businesses. And it's important to check this, and like these little companies, like micro companies, are at 94% made of one or two people, and little companies that reach maybe 10 employees. But really, there is very little knowledge about how they can get involved and what they are supposed to do. In that sense, we have found out that there are some central things, like not implementing general things, but trying to address that per sectors, because all the dynamics for transparency in the sector and with the examples that you have given to us, they are not the same in all the sectors. So last year, for example, we did an exercise with the software sector, and we did a strategy that we call Transpol App, and we were telling them, take attention. These are the risks in terms of tools for corruption. This year we're going to start with the construction sector. And the other thing that we have been doing that's very important as well, talking about this leadership going all the way from top to bottom. This corruption topic doesn't have to go out of the analysis of having some corporate governance that's stronger. This is kind of the system that will work inside the same company, having someone who's asking what's supposed to do, what we're supposed to do, having some type of officer that helps to review what's being done in several aspects. That's what we have been trying to do so that the companies are aware, and they can say and they have a proper role in that aspect. So a sector that tends to corruption more often, well, we don't have that evaluated very much with like certain data, but what we are trying to do is, because the dynamics are kind of different, is trying to work with them in a different way, because there are some of them with who have, for example, more access to public licitations, access to more processes. There are some who, for example, want to start having a bigger international impact, and they are finding out that internationally in certain countries they are requiring much more cases that show that there are some inner problems. So for example, if you want to access a new market, you need to change, and there is some risk. So I will not be able to tell you per sector, but what we have found out is that there's an importance to do it in a different way per sector, of course. How much do these denouncing mechanisms work in the different entities in Ecuador? Uh, well, there's not a chain that finds this pace properly in the different in the survey that we saw. It's important to highlight, for example, when you ask the executives if they find out corruption action, what do you think you should do? 75% said denounce. But then the next question is, from those 75% that should denounce, how many did it actually? So when you find out that the answer, like from the 75% don't know where to go to, from the business people at least, and the ones who have tried, they see like trying to access justice, like they access to a justice system that is also corrupted, that invites for corruption. So you either you back down, or you just simply look for some other type of way. But if we don't find the final sector for justice, for example, the high investigation aspect, or all those investigations that never advance, what happens in the, for example, in the attorney offices, there are lawsuits that pass years, and sometimes they don't advance, and those processes stay there, and they become like historical memory of the countries in Latin America. And there are some aspects about this. For example, first we have the capacity and the lack of professional politicians in Latin America. Uh, politics and professionals is not very different from like a lawyer or a doctor, and etc. So it's a problem that there are no professional presidents and professional politicians in Colombia that have some standards for corruption handling in public sector. For example, one example of a Latin America politician, for example, that we can say this one is kind of similar to Bill Clinton or Barack Obama. Well, I think we get into trouble if we put names, but on the other side, we can see, for example, the determined people with the emerge of these outsiders in many countries. It's not only a phenomenon in Latin America. Let's see what's how going on in Europe, for example, in the U.S., because there's being President Trump is being investigated from the events of January 6th. I think it's crazy because Trump leaves the White House. He takes 30,000 boxes with nuclear information, a whole bunch of things going on, and nothing happens. Well, probably if the Democrats don't get upset, but like they 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 don't do, no, nothing happens. It doesn't advance. But like what happens with a politician? Like those documents have a chain of custody. They cannot have them like in any place. Like taking the national security documents to home. That's something that cannot happen. That's what you were saying about the American institutions. There's a democracy that's leaving many questions because, for example, Trump puts three judges in the Supreme Court, and now these guys are reversing the right for abortion. That was a right that was active since like the 70s. So, for example, this situation, these public affairs, like not stopping thinking about these customs in Latin America, for example. We are used to having and to checking and checking these personal relationships more than the public relationships. We decrease, we stop paying attention to this type of value. More than 40% of the people who were interviewed, they say that if you have a friend, a relative, or someone close to you, it's going to be easier for you to get this or that type of contract. And not, that's not ignore this type of quote, this famous saying, like, who do I know? Who do I know if I get to, if I have to do something? Who do I know that can help me? And that's a problem there, because when the situation is a personal, of personal character and not a professional, then there's a lot being lost there. Because, for example, in the contracts, because if they pass through corruption and they are approved, there's usually not the best option for people, and that's a loss in social value, because so the people, the society receives a bad project, because besides being corrupt, it's a bad project, and there's a social loss in the countries in Latin America. So lower rates of growth, higher rates of corruption in other cases, and economical problems that they face itself. Because when you remove corruption, you don't need to go to these aspects. And for example, what would the current tax reform mean? The corruption aspect of it, you need to have something to compare. And going back to the idea of the kids, like you're not stealing the food of a kid, because like the different uh, food school uh, programs, because sometimes they don't eat anything in this in the house, or they just eat when they what they give them in schools. And if these people steal the money from their foods, they are stealing their futures, because if a boy is not receiving the nutrients and the feeding and the food that he needs, he's never going to reach the same level of advancement that other kids are going to face. He lost his childhood, and his brain is not going to develop the same way. So I think food in Colombia is a big problem. Well, now that you touched this topic, so that you see that we have this same talk in Ecuador, the government set some type of program called 1,000 days. It includes the mother, the gestation, and the first 2 years, the mother lactancy, the months of pregnancy with maternal control, and you see that 3 out of 10 kids either do not eat every day or just eat once a day. And what do you think about that in terms of opportunities for that generation, when those first days, first years are fundamental for the connection and for the development of the neuronal development? And this is a problem that has name and last names, and there are many entities in Ecuador that have tried to find to generate some spaces for private programs to stop these malnutrition problems in Ecuador. I think the role of the companies and businesses, all of these aspects and the income and expenses, and there's a concern as well for the citizens. And we have been working as well on different topics in the cities. In the case of many entrepreneurs and businessmen, there are some malnourishment problems in Ecuador, and they are committed to be able to reach that point, because they understand that a boy is not going to have the same opportunities as some other who has the same abilities, and they have the capacity to generate other type of
problems like that. So how much are the businesses committed from the Chamber of Commerce, as you see, from like nutrition and welfare? So very much we in the Chamber of Commerce we have a whole line of inclusion and diversity and added value and shared value, so that we have shared this so that these actions with social impact are addressed from a shared point of view, so that it implies that it's included in the model and is not isolated, so that it can be done in a continuous manner. We have done it in some ways, like first, for example, in terms of inclusive recruitment for young people, for women, and this is key to be able to adapt to the market value and to the work market. And so we need to have that as opportunities for growth. And we have also realized that it's important to support in those business ideas that they have. So we have some entrepreneurship initiatives that are inclusive and that take all of these ideas that sometimes are very bad and take into account these conditions of some people. So it's better to try to advance into these ideas so that they can link to some type of company. And we have been working on that thing. That's in terms of a phase of like liability, and in terms of social programs and a reach in communities where it operates. We have been trying to accompany the companies so that this is not something divided, but they can have a bigger scope and reach. What the companies try to do sometimes is to impact in the communities where they operate. So, for example, in Bogotá and Cundinamarca, you'll find some examples in regions and municipalities for example, in Cajicá, Tocancipá, that are been trying to articulate with the municipalities to see what the needs are and how they can support the municipality itself. In Bogota, we see that too. There are companies that are, for example, in an industrial area, and they know it's an intensive area, and they have tried to put some kindergartens or something like that for those kids from the moms who are working, and they can reach some type of better lives. And in terms of business corruption, is there type of social sanction or something like that, or not necessarily? I would say not necessarily. I think basically what we have heard and what we have been able to reflect upon from a Latin American point of view, we have a very permissive culture. It's kind of the know-how of how we work, how it works for us. A new government reaches here and it is like, who do you know here? This is a kind of a network aspect that would allow people to have a contract or have something like that. So I think we're missing a path away so that we can associate it to corruption. So all of this related to gender violence and all of these topics that are so used and so talked about and so addressed in our culture is something that we sometimes put under the carpet and we ignore them, and it's put as a bad example that we don't need to follow. So I think there's a big way ahead so that this can have a social generalized impact. So in Ecuador, there is no, like, in the moment our politicians are still voted and chosen. There's no such a thing, and not neither for the businessmen. For example, if there's someone involved, Jose Graña, and he's involved in the Odebrecht case. Uh, he's part of a club also that also exists here. There's of oligarchy, and they work in their kind of rings of power, and they cannot be taken out from there. But a businessman, for example, and not like equality, like sanction, but like a businessman of a lower hierarchy or lower, that's not in this type of rings, they in the end get more attacked more strongly. And I think the compliance is not very useful, but I think that when you believe that the compliance is everything, there's a problem there. The second thing, well, when they consider the businessman or woman as a hero, they bet in money in a country that's kind of unstable. The state that doesn't generate employment. The businessman generates employment, but if they put it as a hero, it's kind of to be blamed. It's kind of something that people would regret, and they need to regret on that, and the state kind of affects them or impacts them. And I tell you what, in Colombia, being a businessman is kind of very severe, and it's a very severe action, a collective situation that's pushed with the kind of uh, the president arrived 2 years later to the businessman meeting, and I think there's a whole sensation. Like if I make more than 10 million a month, then there's a big problem. But I generate employment every day. I have people under my charge, and if I denounce corruption, there is a matter like to put a whole team to tell me exactly how this and that works. And I have some employers, I have employees at home, I have kids, and so the matter of being a businessman in Colombia is a big problem here. It's a big issue, but I would like to finish with some suggestions and other aspects. So I will start. I think the solution is very simple. Hong Kong did it. They decreased corruption in the 70s. In Bolivia, they did it in La Paz. In terms of Avaroa, with you as a mayor in La Paz. So first, measurements for prevention, not as many. Dissuasive. Well, we know that we like to have this type of um, laws, but we need to put enforcement. We need to enforce these laws, otherwise law is useless. If law is implemented, which is a cost for everyone, and that's why the justice system is capital. And third, education. When we spoke about education, we speak about young people, teenagers, and the adults are kind of exempted, like ignored. So when the young people grow up, they kind of get contagious, but they get infected by this type of bad practices. So this is a pattern of conduct, and I think in that point, we as adults, we need to get educated as well, how not to answer a WhatsApp message while driving, not saying like, okay, I slapped my wife because of an accident, so that's normal. So we need to be aware of those type of things. So I would say, I dare to say that that's a very important type of solution in the fight against corruption and all type of anti-ethic actions. Well, as well, kind of to complement what you said, with four central points. First, to continue with this type of measurements, this type of measuring to give us clear numbers to what exists. And I think this is a very important tool to give us some proper numbers and comparative data, and also to be able to have companies to measure internally and complementary what they are saying. Second, the visualization. I think we need to visualize. I think we need to make those people who do good things visible. I think put them visible, and put it in both ways. So how does it go bad if you continue doing those type of actions? How can you generate some value for you and for others if you do it in the right way? And linked to this, I think there's a general topic, and is the idea of consciousness and transformation, and a cultural transformation, facing this kind of tolerance, looking into these actions, and this kind of thirst, and this eagerness to reach this change of consciousness, and saying and knowing that this is bad and we need to change it. And lastly, I would say these focused actions, what we are trying to do in the chamber, not like separate things, but like taking sectors, taking separate individuals, the business sector, the education sector, so that we can reach to some change. Well, as a last comment, I would like to celebrate this event and congratulate CIPE because I think this study what needs to establish is some type of breakthrough, and it doesn't have to be some type of mid-log aspect. It doesn't have to be the presentation of a study, but I hope a new study gets us together again in the future to see and talk if these actions that were taken had any proper positive effect. But I think we need to also address that and all how this corruption topic can take us. When the corruption decreases and this is seen and addressed, in cultural aspects, the different situations in Latin America. Without any doubt, we're going to find spaces to consolidate democracies, and without any doubt, we can move to a side the type of populism that exists in the region. I think the fight against corruption needs to be a proper, correct uh, battle. And I think the Chamber of Commerce, we did a campaign that was very interesting for many people. Now we have this sentence, like this type of kind of uh, this idea of the person who is kind of more vivid to do these type of actions like cutting a line or things like that. Not seeing it as a virtue because we sometimes focus on trying to break the problem. But it's also, I think we need to leave some space to thinking why is it good to be honest? It's a good business to be honest, and I think it's very important to understand that there are topics that are way bigger that can get solved, like the democratic solidification in our countries, and for example, the idea of removing this ghost of the populism that comes from any type of politic path. And I think the battle of corruption is the right thing to do. And I would add two to this list. First, like social sanction, I think it's very important. And it happens to me. For example, someone goes with me because, sometimes I have very radical views to do some things. And sometimes someone goes to me and says something to me and he curses at me. And then I tell her, like, why don't you go and insult him or her? uh, because he is the person who's stealing from you. So I think social sanction is very important. I hate, for example, when I find people from Interbolsa and that I say these people are thieves, and I feel like going to tell them, but it is not my business, of course. But I think education is very important, yes, to establish what can be done and what cannot be done. I think as a journalist, many times, uh, many bosses have trying to tell me or talk to me into some aspects, but they talk to me and they have never suggested any type of thing like trying to making me do some things that are not good. I think that's not journalism or things that are anti-ethic. So yeah, like thank you very much everyone for being here. Thank you for the Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for inviting me. I felt part of the panel and I tried to participate. Thank you very much, and it was very interesting.
Por este conversatorio, sus valiosos comentarios.
Thanks to our panelists and to our moderator. So with this, we conclude the event for today, and we would like to invite you to look for opportunities for public procurement, for a transparent public procurement in the Andean region. Thank you very much. Have a good day.